welcome everyone. I am super, super excited, and I apologize for my voice, slipping away from me. But we it was interesting. Brian and I have had some lengthy conversation, and Brian at the beginning when he first came into LifeVantage, was a co-associate, and we worked with them as partners. But he and I have become great friends, and I consider him a really, really close friends. We were able to bring in the new year together with him and his beautiful family and his wife. And I'm super, super excited because that collaboration has turned into really what a lot of us has been requesting. There's been every single one of you has asked me to some degree, hey, Right, is there any way that we can do kind of a collaboration on our products, specifically the science, how it works, why it works the way that it does? And Brian was all over it. He said, absolutely, I would love to do that. We picked Wednesday. We still have yet to determine what solid time we will have for everyone. So just be patient with us as this evolves, but we are committed to being in front of you with regards to absolutely amazing information that maybe you have never even heard to this point. I know there's certain things that I've listened to with Brian with regards to him assisting me with certain people as I've recruited, and I continually learn every time he opens his mouth. And he did a presentation that I watched. I watched the simplicity of it, but yet it was very sophisticated, but done in a layman's term with specifics to Nerf 2. And I asked him, I said, hey, let's kick off the year with that presentation, because I felt like that was the best explanation that I've ever heard for the 4 years that I've been here at LifeVantage. And so I'm honored and privileged to bring my great friend and also our VP, Brian Dixon, over product development. He is a brain amongst brain. I'm going to put his bio in the chat. So if you guys want to just copy and paste that to your notes or anything, it's really important that you just read through that bio. It will blow your mind, but it's way too long for me to go through it right now. And we will be off of this phone call at 5:55 so the everyone can join that premiere call. There's so much going on at corporate. There's so much going on with this company. It's a brand new year, and I'm super excited to bring on Brian Dixon. Brian, are you with me, my friend?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
I got you, man. I got you. Yeah. So good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I really appreciate the kind words. The feeling's mutual, the respect's mutual. And let me start by saying Happy New Year to everybody. And gosh, I didn't realize we were also science hungry here. So maybe I should say welcome science nerds as well. It's always good to be amongst my people. So I appreciate everyone taking the time tonight. But yeah, I'm going to run through a presentation centered around nutrigenomics, NRF2, and really kind of talking about disruptive innovation, especially in the nutrition space. I don't think we talk a lot about it, and I don't think we talk a lot about it because, quite frankly, until really recently, and that is the founding of LifeVantage, there really hasn't been a whole lot of disruptive innovation. So if we start, I think we should first define what is disruptive innovation. And I'm sure everybody on the call knows this, but just to kind of reset the playing field, it's an innovation that creates a new market and eventually disrupts an existing market that will displace even the most established market-leading companies and products in the world. So let's talk about a few examples. I mean, think about the telephone. Are any of us really wired to the phone anymore? I'm sure we all at least have a cell phone, and maybe just a few of us still have a landline. Think about what the car, and especially Henry Ford, did to the horse and buggy market. In fact, we might be in the midst of another disruptive innovation. And who knows, someday we might be driving around in self-driving electric vehicles. Think about what the internet has done to the encyclopedia market. I mean, I'm old enough to remember door-to-door salesmen going around selling encyclopedia sets. In fact, we had a set in our house, but not just encyclopedias, but think about what the internet has done to just libraries even. I mean, I can't remember, embarrassed to say, the last time I went to a library. There's a really interesting story around Kodak, right? We used to think of them as the film and camera company. But maybe you guys have heard the story that sometime in the 70s, Kodak was approached with the technology to do digital photography. If you can believe it, it seems crazy now, but they actually declined on that opportunity because they said it would cannibalize their film sales. Kodak is no longer in business as we know it today. So it's not just the cell phone disrupting the hardwired phone market, but think about what the launch of the iPhone did to the cellular phone company or this cellular phone business. I recently rewatched the launch video from Steve Jobs. He had to say no fewer than 5 times that this one device could store all your music, could make calls, and actually search the internet, right? People couldn't comprehend that when it was first launched. And now we expect our phones to do all of those things and so much more. In fact, if you think about it, we hold the whole sum of human knowledge in our hands now, right? We have access to it at least. Unbelievable. I mean, think about how we're meeting here tonight. I'm old enough where I used to have to make my presentations on little, I don't even remember what they're called anymore, but literally little photographic slides. We'd have to take pictures of what we wanted to present, and you had to load them into a carousel and hope you got the order right as you were going through your slides. Then think what Keynote, PowerPoint has done to digital presentations and how we're all meeting here tonight over Zoom. The gig economy, think about what Uber and Lyft have done to the taxi industry. Think about what Airbnb and VRBO have done to the hotel and resort industry. And I think I'd even put direct selling in here as well. Think about all these like side hustles that are going on now. And this gig economy is really taking over and changing retail as we know it. But let's tie this back into disruptive innovation in nutrition. And to have that conversation, I want to say it this way. I doubt anybody will know the answer to this, but do you know when the last 3 essential vitamins were discovered? Vitamin K was discovered in 1939. Folate was discovered in 1941. And the last vitamin to be discovered was vitamin B12 in 1948. So why do I throw these dates up there? Well, we have literally known for the last 70 to 80 years everything the human body needs to function. And I think this is why we see so many different marketing spins, especially around vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, is because they're trying to put some new marketing spin on what is really very old technology. This isn't rocket science. We know what the human body needs to function. But where has there been innovation in nutrition? And I would argue, like I said at the beginning of this call, that there really hasn't been any innovation until the founding of LifeVantage. And that innovation, if you ask me, is nutrigenomics and just a complete switch in how we can utilize nutrition to actually be health promoting. So we really are in the midst of this nutrigenomic revolution. And this concept of nutrigenomics is, as I'm sure most people on the call know, it's nothing more than nutrition working to turn on or activate health promoting genes. In fact, these genes are so important to our overall health and well-being. They have names like anti-stress genes, survival genes, detoxification genes, antioxidant genes, anti-aging genes, survival genes. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So just to illustrate how important this capacity that's inside of almost every single cell inside of our bodies possesses. So to talk about nutrigenomics, we also have to talk about a couple of other things, and that is cell signaling, right? Which is nothing more than the cell's communication network. So there's a whole lot of signals bouncing around inside of the cell that's really coordinating this function. And by doing that, what tends to happen through these cell signaling pathways are genes, these especially health promoting genes, get activated and they can go on and do their health promoting roles inside of the cell. So to take this one step further and to illustrate how important the cellular communication and this gene activation is, I want to start by asking you a question, and that is, do we need a brain to be intelligent? Is it this 3-pound organ that's sitting on top of our shoulders, the place where intelligence resides? Or might intelligence exist in a different format? So I obviously love definitions, but the definition of intelligence is that ability to learn or understand things. And I think it's this first part of the definition that we traditionally think of intelligence as being. It's that kid that was really smart in school, went to a good college, and then went on to get that really prestigious 9-to-5 job at some big corporation. But what's intriguing to me is the second part of this definition. And a form of intelligence is the ability to deal with new or difficult situations. So let's look at some examples around nature and see if we can't find where intelligence is living. Bacteria is an interesting example. Bacteria have been unbelievably successful on the face of this earth, okay? If we took all of the bacteria on Earth and put them on one side of a scale, and we took all the humans on Earth and put them on the other side of the scale, do you know that bacteria would far outweigh the mass of humans that are on this planet? Bacteria are very simple, single-celled organisms, and they very clearly do not have a brain, but yet have been more successful on this earth than we have. If I put a seed in the ground, how do those roots know to grow down and those leaves know to grow up to the sun? Ants, how do they know to follow trails to find food and water and then also find their way back to the nest? Fish, how do they know to swim in schools for safety? Dogs, how do they know how to fetch? So you can see we're kind of working our way up the food chain. Dogs still a very primitive brain, but how do they know how to fetch? Most mammals can get up and walk just minutes after they're born. So would we say that a horse is smarter than a human? Think about some examples inside of ourselves, right? If I get a little paper cut on my finger, do I have to think about that wound healing, or does it just happen on its own? You know, wound healing is actually a really interesting, very stepwise process inside of our bodies that is just happening. Think about yourself sitting here this evening. Are you thinking about the blood flowing through your veins? Are you thinking about all the different signals and inputs that your nerves are communicating to your brain? Are you thinking about your breath or digesting the last meal that you ate? If you were fortunate enough today to get a workout in, are you thinking about those bones being remodeled to build back stronger? Are you thinking about those muscles remodeling so they're getting stronger? Or are those things just happening? So I'll ask you again, do we need a brain to be intelligent, or might intelligence live outside of this organ on top of our shoulders? But if we go back and look at all those examples across biology, I'll ask the question, what did everything have in common? What would you call it? Would you call it luck, skill, adaptation? Maybe we're getting a little bit closer. But if you were to ask me, I would call it instinct, right? All of those examples just know how to do what they're doing. But where would that instinct live inside of our bodies? Well, again, if you ask me, that instinct is going to live inside of our DNA, and more specifically, inside of our genes. But if you think about it, our DNA is really pretty inactive. It's just sitting there and it comes to life when it gets the right stimulus. But the analogy that I like for our DNA and our genes is like the blueprint that's on the screen. Is there a lot of information on that piece of paper? The answer is yeah, absolutely. But can that piece of paper actually build the house? Can it swing a hammer? Can it pour the concrete? Right? The answer is of course not. And this is exactly how our DNA and our genes are working. DNA and our genes are nothing more than the information for the cell to do something. In fact, it takes a very skilled worker to be able to read this piece of paper, to then direct a bunch of other skilled workers to ultimately build the house. Okay, so then who or what would be the workers inside of the cell? Well, it would be proteins, and probably better put that it would be protein enzymes. And enzymes are like these little machines inside of our cell that are actually conducting all the biochemistry. They're running these assembly lines inside of our cells. Okay, so now we know where the information's coming from. We know who the workers are, but who is the boss inside of the cell? And the answer is, it's these cell signaling networks, right? This communication network that lives inside of our cells. And more importantly, and more specifically, it's these highly coordinated cellular signaling pathways inside of our cells that are directing everything that's going on inside of it. And it's really nothing more than A tells B, B tells C, C tells D, D tells somebody else, and then something happens inside of the cell. And so if I actually pull up an old cellular signaling chart that I used to use in graduate school, it would look like this. And I'm not going to walk through this, but I put it up on the screen to illustrate how complex these cellular signaling pathways are. And this is just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of different cell signaling pathways inside of our body. But again, to break it down in its most simple terms, something's activating A tells B, B tells C, C tells D, and then something happens inside of the cell. So then what's actually initiating this cell signaling? What's activating protein A there? And the answer is, it's these things called receptors. And receptors are nothing more than little sensor molecules that are floating around inside of our cells. And they're floating around until the right stimulus comes along and activates it. And then we get that chain of events that occurs. And there's a lot of specificity with the signal, the signaling molecule that actually binds to the receptor. So there's lots of signals floating around, and there's a lot of receptors floating around, but there's a lot of specificity, and it's a lot like a lock and a key. So just like the key to my front door won't unlock your front doors, your keys won't unlock my front doors, there's a whole bunch of specificity that's going on. But to put it even a little bit more simply, I like to think of these cell signaling pathways as being like a chain of dominoes, okay? And if you've ever seen these big domino shows, you know that they'll be setting up these dominoes for hours, if not days. And then afterwards, they like to have some big grand finale that occurs, right? So something is happening at the end of these spectacles. So here, I'm going to show you just a quick video. There's no sound. But can you see on the screen all of those different aspects we just briefly touched on related to cell signaling? So can you see that signaling molecule would be that gentleman's finger? The receptor, or that sensing molecule, would be that first domino. And then A tells B, B tells C, and ultimately something big happens. So if you think about it, a relatively small input was responsible to ultimately knock down all of those dominoes. And this is important when we're talking about cell signaling and the consequences it can have to our health, because there is signal amplification that can occur through these cell signaling pathways. And I can give you a couple of real world examples you might be familiar with. If I was a bodybuilder going to the gym and I injected just relatively small amounts of testosterone, I would be able to put on unphysiological amounts of muscle mass. We give women tiny little birth control pills, and we can completely remodel their reproductive physiology. Small inputs can have massive consequences inside of the cell. And that's because of the signal amplification that can occur. So here's, sticking with that domino analogy, here's another way that we can kind of illustrate that point. So that first domino is weighing just a couple of grams, a fraction of an ounce, and that last domino is going to weigh right around 100 pounds. So watch how we can get that signal amplification to occur. Right? It's amazing. And this is the power of cell signaling. And this is what's coordinating cellular function. So if we ask ourselves, then what is the purpose of these cell signaling pathways? Well, ultimately, their job is to be able to react and respond to both their internal and external environments. Remember that definition of intelligence, the ability to react and respond to new and difficult situations. This is where that intelligence or that instinct is living. And it literally doesn't matter what cellular signaling pathway I show you, but they are all working in the same way. Something activates A tells B, and ultimately something is happening inside of the cell. Now, it's interesting. LifeVantage was founded in 2003 based on this notion of nutrigenomics. But what's interesting is that term nutrigenomics wasn't even identified or coined until 2004, and in my mind, solidified in the scientific literature in this paper in 2005, right? So 2 years after the founding of LifeVantage. But this paper is so important to that concept of nutrigenomics because these researchers wanted to answer the question, why is chocolate, and specifically that dark, bitter, maybe nasty chocolate, so good for us? And specifically, why is it so good for cardiovascular health? So it's interesting. So the scientists, they went in and they started teasing out the different components of the chocolates. And like scientists do, they try to start with the biggest, easiest things first. But they weren't able to replicate the health benefits of chocolate with these compounds that were found in the largest quantities. It wasn't until they started looking at these compounds in chocolate that were there in relatively very small quantities inside of the chocolate that they started to see these cardiovascular health benefits. But what was even more perplexing was when they gave these compounds back to humans, they found that they were very poorly absorbed. They were very quickly metabolized. So what made it in was very quickly metabolized and very quickly excreted from our bodies. So how could compounds that are found in very low concentrations, that are absorbed very poorly, are very quickly metabolized and excreted from the body, how could they possibly be having these huge consequences on cardiovascular health? Well, after a series of follow-up studies, what they found was these compounds couldn't make it directly into the cell. They were just too big to diffuse through the cellular membranes. What they found was that they were binding to the receptors, those sensor molecules, activating cell signaling pathways and turning on protein enzymes that were beneficial to cardiovascular health. Just an absolutely amazing story of how nutrition can be leveraged through cell signaling to turn on these very important health promoting genes. And so this is the concept across the entire product line, where we look for the nutrients or the signaling molecules that can activate these receptor sensors or the switches where we can then yield the health benefit from them, right? With Protandim NRF2 synergizer, same story. The nutrients or signaling molecules activating the switch that are ultimately turning on these health promoting genes. The same with Protandim NAD synergizer, right? The signaling molecules activating the switches or the receptors inside of the cells to ultimately yield their benefit. And so this is that concept of nutrigenomics that's woven throughout our entire product line, whether it's our hair care and skin care, whether it's our gut health products, whether it's our brain health or nootropic products. This concept of nutrigenomic nutrigenomics is woven in to the entire product line and the products that I've shown and many others that I haven't shown. And so this is exactly how LifeVantage has been the pioneer in disrupting in human nutrition. And it's through this concept of nutrigenomics and unlocking this health potential that all of our cells contain. And exactly why we say, flip the switch, feel better, do more.